Techsauce Global, sparking innovative thoughts. The Near Future Podcast, in partnership with Techsauce and SDGX.
Welcome back, everybody. This is David Gallipo at the SDGX Techsauce Near Future Podcast, where we're really discussing about a lot of the new disruptions, new opportunities, new threats, what's going to be happening over the next 5 to 10 years. And today we've got a special guest coming in all the way from New Zealand, where we will actually discuss a little bit about New Zealand and the current situation right now. So I'll let Guy introduce himself. So I'll just hand over and Guy, how are things?
David, hey, great to see you. Great to hear your voice. And thank you for the invitation to be here. So I'm in Wellington, New Zealand, the capital of little Aotearoa, New Zealand here. And obviously with everything playing out in the world with COVID, pandemic, everything else going on, I feel very lucky and very privileged to be in New Zealand. And thankfully, due to really kind of early intervention and strong government leadership, we're in a pretty stable and good place with COVID. So I'm able to go outside and interact socially and do lots of hangout things that I'm mindful that not everybody in the world at the moment is able to experience. So great to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
How's actually, I mean, COVID is sort of up and down around the world. It's getting better in some places, it's getting worse in some places. But how's it really impacting, I mean, your day-to-day, what you do?
I think if you just look at the kind of New Zealand domestic level, the impact isn't much at the moment. I think, early on, kind of April, May, we went into lockdown, full lockdown like everyone else. And we've had a couple of, escalations since, where the country's gone back into a very temporary and small phase of lockdown. But otherwise, we've been mostly able to move around, still wearing masks and a small degree of social distancing. But otherwise, we're able to do large-scale events in the country. I think, we've had big events at stadiums with tens of thousands of people. There's been I think most of the disruption is really the fact that borders have been largely locked off. And so that's had a big impact for the country in terms of, the impact on tourism, which New Zealand has been very dependent on traditionally, or some impacts on trade. But otherwise, in terms of day-to-day life, as New Zealanders, we've got things incredibly lucky at the moment, where we are able to move around, socialise, explore the country, and, in the most part, do most of, if not all of our day-to-day work.
I had the privilege of joining your event last year. Tell us a bit about the event, but also tell us what's going to happen this year.
Yeah, sure. So I guess in the context of that, 10 years ago, I had an idea. I could see all of the incredible creativity and potential of young people around me when I was studying at university, but at the same time became increasingly aware of a lot of the global issues that we face around climate change, the huge inequality that exists in our world. The list goes on. And I just thought, imagine if we could tap into that incredible creativity, the optimism, the enthusiasm, the energy of young people. I thought, imagine if every young New Zealander unleashed their potential to change the world, what would it take to make that happen? And so that is kind of a big, bold vision that has got me out of bed every day for the last decade. One of the things that we do is run an annual summit called Festival for the Future. And last year, when COVID did happen and we did go into lockdown, we transformed what's traditionally an in-person experience into a virtual summit. We built relationships with some amazing organizations like the Obama Foundation, the United Nations, global change makers, yourself. We ended up having people from 57 countries around the world join us. And what completely blew me away in terms of quite a global experience. And I guess that's what played out last year. Festival for the Future is one of the kind of the big flagships of what we do as an organisation. But we run a few other things. We run something called the Impact Awards, which gives out $30,000 in prizes to young people doing great stuff to make a difference for our future. We run a year-round leadership development program, particularly for young people in rural and provincial communities. And then we run a social enterprise speaker bureau that represents top talent and puts profit back into scholarship opportunities for young people. So that's kind of our portfolio, if you like, within Inspiring Stories, with a big, bold vision to back young people to change the world. This year, 2021, is obviously quite a different year as we're all kind of figuring out getting through COVID. For us, our Festival for the Future has just been announced as one of the opening events for a fancy new convention centre in Wellington in New Zealand in 2023. And so there's a large kind of in-person component, but also very much looking to build on the online and virtual experiences that we prototyped last year. So, very much looking to build on the global conversation. And Festival is very much a showcase, if you like, of leadership and impact, leadership and innovation for impact. And so really bringing together a diverse range of different leaders, entrepreneurs, innovators to explore some of these big issues that affect our future, to put a real showcase on what's possible, and to support the conversations around where could we or should we go from here.
Well, that sort of ties into exactly the sort of area I want to talk about, sort of the future of leadership. And clearly I'm a little bit older than you, and I grew up in this sort of era where the Harvard masters were coming up with this sort of managerial theory and strategy, and how that was going to sort of lead the world. It really was built on specialization and not so much on generalization. It was really built on shareholder value, profitability, efficiency, effectiveness, these types of concepts, on the way that businesses should be run. And then we've seen how that's been now sort of what translated over the last 20 years towards public sector. The public sector should be acting more like private sector in these types of things. But now we see this huge transformation, not only the digital transformation and Industrial Revolution 4.0, we are seeing a mindset transformation that's happening right now. I think partly because of the concept or the framework of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs on one side. So we have these concepts about green economy. We have the concepts about sustainable capitalism, these types of things on one side. But we're also seeing this big burst of innovation, entrepreneurship, specifically around social entrepreneurship. So these types of concepts. And where do you think, what is sort of where do you think this is actually going to go? Because I see a lot of the old stalwarts, sort of the old school, trying to hang on as much as they can and not be giving the space to a lot of the younger leaders to really come up, specifically in public sector. But I'm seeing this where there's a lot of resistance for this transformation. What are you seeing on this?
Oh, that's a big question. Where are we going? In every way, change is inevitable, and it's just kind of where we go and how we get there. I think, as soon as you start learning about a lot of these big, complex social and environmental challenges that we face, you can't not be aware of that stuff, and I think, at least for my journey as a young person, when I learned about climate change and the potential implications for my future and my kids' future, I found that stuff super confronting and overwhelming, to the point where the career that I had been considering was just like, actually, I don't want to go down that path anymore. For me, my passion was entrepreneurship, was design, was creativity. What could I do with my limited time and energy to try and make a difference for our future? That, for me, that was quite a confronting moment when I was just coming out of university. And I see hundreds and thousands of young people having similar experiences where these challenges that we face are more visible than ever before. And I think at one end of the spectrum, that can be really, overwhelming and disempowering. And so actually the need for hope, the need for optimism, the need for leadership has never been greater. And I think the challenges that we're wrestling with are global and they're local, and there's huge complexity within that. There's all the capital required, there's the right kind of leadership and mindset required, there's considering the short term versus the long term. And I think especially for like a lot of our governments, be they local governments or central governments, they're not necessarily set up to deal with this kind of complexity. And I think the solutions that we need will not come from any single sector. This is not just a private sector thing. It's not just a capital thing. It's not just a policy or government leadership thing. It's not just a grassroots community action thing. Actually, it's going to take all of us from all sectors, with new mindsets, with new tools for collaboration, with new resources for investment in those solutions. And that's complex, that's trying to figure stuff out in a way that, as a globe, we've never really had to deal with this before, let alone collaborate and put, in some cases, quite urgent solutions in place. And I think in some ways, the pandemic of COVID has given us a glimpse in terms of, what could a global response to urgent crises and challenges look like? So I think, like, in terms of that mindset, in terms of the leadership, like in New Zealand, we've got a relatively young Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, and probably the most diverse government that we've ever had before. And, there's some challenges happening within central government that we still need to figure out and solve, absolutely. But in terms of that kind of really swift response to COVID, at least in the pandemic, that level of kind of swift political leadership has enabled us as a country to get to a much safer and better place. And in terms of how we kind of figure out that global response, like you say, I think we've still got a long way to go. And I think there's so many different perspectives and approaches across generations that for, in many ways, in terms of solving the climate crisis or addressing COVID, we have to figure this stuff out faster than what we are at the moment.
But how is that impacting across the universities, specifically in New Zealand? I'm teaching a course right now on sustainable public policy.
Yeah.
And it's at the university and the School of Integrated Innovation. So these are sort of new concepts, and these are kids. It's an undergraduate class in their second year. It's a brand new program that's been put together. And besides taking sustainable governance, they're also taking artificial intelligence, they're taking climate and green tech. So they're taking a lot of these fundamental areas around traditional areas of sustainability. But I find that a lot of the students were crowding into my class because this concept of sustainable public service is really interesting for them. But I don't see that at a lot of universities. They're really sort of going back to the traditional legacy sort of academic programs and everything else. Are you seeing a shift? Are you working with universities to develop some sort of curriculum for this new leadership?
Yeah, so we work with the universities a little bit, and I think, even in New Zealand, there's 7 universities, obviously hundreds around the world. But of course, it's a sector that has also been smashed by COVID, right? Like New Zealand's model of tertiary education is largely dependent on international students. And as soon as borders close down, those revenues take a massive hit. And I think, with all due respect to our universities, I think they've been quite slow moving to take up opportunities to deliver learning and education online. And I think there's definitely no shortage of interest and demand from young people in terms of leadership for sustainability or governance for sustainability. I think in many cases, our tertiary institutions have probably been quite slow to respond there. So I've been kind of seeking alternative ways of learning, connecting, growing. And I think that's really interesting, as soon as COVID hit and the ability to study in person, at least here, and many other parts of the world, is just not the same as it was previously. Immediately you kind of go to other places online, so if you can get a world-class education from any institution globally learning online, that's a super appealing prospect in this day and age. So I'm not surprised that you're seeing a fair bit of demand in those spaces. I think for us as a country, we're still very much figuring out what does that kind of real education for impact look like. In fact, our one of our kind of big parts of government here that's focused on education is also asking the same question right now. So it's an important question to be asking, but also probably one that we should have been asking kind of 5 to 10 years ago, and have some solutions in place that were, that could enable and support a digital first mode of learning and delivery as well. But for whatever reason, we haven't been in that place. COVID's happened, and now I think it's just accelerated the push to figure out what world-class education for impact can look like.
Well, I think it's going to be a big drive. I remember when I was with the United Nations, and you see the diversity of projects and the diversity of areas, focus areas, thematic areas that they're working in. And quite honestly, if I had all the money, I would invest in education and probably political corruption. These are the two areas that are really sort of hurting. And I think on one side, they're hurting the youth and creating that opportunities, but they're also hurting, equity, inclusiveness, these types of areas and everything else. And even though we do a lot of other things, I like to focus on the academic side, because I think that's going to be, the youth are going to be the ones that are going to drive this change. And unfortunately, the baby boomers didn't quite get around to it. The millennials didn't quite get around to it. It's this new generation that has grown up with the internet, grown up with a lot of these new technologies. And when you look forward, when you look at automation, for example, I mean, that's going to do a big hit on jobs. There's a lot of sugarcoating going on at the moment, saying, as old jobs get deleted, new jobs will be created, but the latency, especially on the skills required for a lot of these new clusters of technology, there will be a latency, there will be a bit of a lag. Then we have the conversation around universal basic income, sort of a robot tax, how that's going to sort of come in to fill the gap. And certainly COVID is a great little sandbox for looking at that, with the amount of jobs being lost at the moment. And the opportunities going forward, that where a lot of the students, I think, have the opportunity and are deciding to take a gap year because they can't go to the school of choice because of the limited mobility, to take a gap year and maybe do a bit of volunteering, maybe do a little bit of help, look at impact, look at some of these newer areas that don't have a lot of structure around them right now, like impact. And I think it's a huge upside.
Yeah, and look, I think, in terms of education, and I can really only speak to New Zealand's take on education, but the traditional bricks and mortar in-person experience, in some ways, there's those in-person experiences can be incredibly powerful, but I think that the model and the kind of the focus of education has to shift a bit. I think the notion of a career in the 20th century has changed dramatically over the last few years. I think that question around how could you position something like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals at the heart of learning and actions as a result of learning, right? So if you kind of think about global challenges, local or global impact, and an opportunity to embed the learning about the global challenges with tangible examples to create impact in a way that is embedded through our primary school years. So I've got a 4-year-old kid who totally knows about some of these global challenges at 4 years old, right through to, primary, secondary, into tertiary education. Like, is there not a way that you can anchor education and learning throughout that whole spectrum of a person's development, from child through to young adult, so that it's anchored around the Sustainable Development Goals, so that it still enables you to kind of work on real-world meaningful projects that can create tangible outcomes? And along the way, you're building your teamwork skills, your communication skills, your problem-solving skills, your critical thinking skills. You're also learning things like maths or whatever the kind of areas that you want to specialize in, but you can do that in a way that's actually woven around real-world tangible projects for impact that can track, outcomes against some of these global goals. I think that's where we need to shift globally as a model for education. And I think both the in-person and the online experiences that enable us to tap into a global community, learn, share different innovations and examples with what's working in different parts of the world. For me, that's really the future of education.
But how does that tie in now when you're talking about leadership capacity building? And on one side, you've got the philosophy of leadership. And then you've got sort of that movement of leadership, the sort of transitional movement that's happening right now, whether it's going from national and being decentralized, going into very, the smaller villages having a lot of autonomy on leadership, or you've got the other side really looking at disruptive, being agile, taking and leveraging a lot of innovative techniques, models, approaches, and these types of things. So how does that tie into your capacity building for leadership? How do you see that? What are some of the key messages that you were trying to get across?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that kind of the real traditional approach to leadership is probably one that's more kind of top down, command and control.
I'm the boss and you're not.
Yeah. And I think we've kind of evolved in some spaces to, you don't necessarily have to be right at the top. It can be kind of grassroots, bottom up. It can be much more distributed and self-organizing, certainly leading by example and just taking initiative. And I think the why of leadership has just become more and more connected with that idea of global challenges and needing to rise to the challenges of our time. So leadership in that context is a really kind of key message that we see emerging, and also one that we look to reinforce. Something like the school strike for climate, where an 18 or 17-year-old in New Zealand could see what Greta was doing globally on social media and thought, maybe we should have a school strike for climate in New Zealand. Quick look around, I don't think anybody else is doing that, maybe I'll start one, and so tech and tools, initial small-scale turnout for the strikes, and then a few months later, with a little bit of support, the right people around it, turned out to be, for New Zealand at least, the second biggest civic action in history, with 170,000 people showing up in support.
Wow.
170,000 on global scale doesn't sound massive, but in the New Zealand context, proportionately, that's huge. It's the second biggest civic action in history. And that was largely, if not entirely led by young people, completely distributed, not much hierarchy. But that why, that purpose, that core reason for doing it, for wanting to see action on climate change, that was the powerful driver and motivator that got everyone out of bed to turn up, to show and support. What did it contribute to? It's always hard to kind of pinpoint a specific outcome, but in New Zealand, absolutely now, we have a Zero Carbon Act that's been passed into law. We've got a climate commission that's been established. That conversation around, both mitigation and adaptation around climate change is much more current and topical at both the local government, central government, and in the business community and investment community. It's hard to say, if the school strike for climate, singularly resulted in all of that stuff, but certainly it was a powerful contributor that elevated the need for action and built momentum around that conversation. And I think what's beautiful around that is that, young people played such a significant role in sparking and driving that movement. And I think time and time again, if you look at, other kind of significant social movements throughout history, it's often young people who have had a real kind of key leadership role in that. So I think in terms of your question around how is leadership evolving, what are the key messages of the mindset? I think one thing that I'm really aware of is that we set up with a big, bold vision to back young people to change the world. But increasingly, just recognise there is more and more and more value and relevance in building bridges across generations. So actually every single one of us has a stake in the future. And if we ask ourselves, well, what does being a good ancestor look like? Most people would talk about wanting to leave this place in a better place than what we've inherited in it. And I think for us, our work increasingly is trying to build bridges between the young and old, and recognising that, some young people can have incredible ideas, energy, optimism, drive to make stuff happen. And if you pair that with the older generation, who often, I guess as we get older, we accumulate wealth, we accumulate assets often. It's often our older populations that are in positions of power that control policies and legislation and resources. But if you can bring those groups together with a shared vision for what the future could look like, I think there's huge magic and opportunity in that.
I think that's a fascinating insight, actually, this concept of bridging, because you do hear about the different generations, and every generation has the role and responsibility. But you don't talk about that intergenerational sort of relationship between them. Who's doing the handoff? And maybe this touches a bit into this concept of storytelling, and which I think is a very undervalued at the moment. I love storytelling, and you can't beat a good story. I mean, a lot of the stories are formulaic, they're whether true or misinformation or whatever, but the ability to really relay what you're trying to say in a story, a narrative, that comes across and cuts across all the generations, or cuts across all the sort of the marginalized communities and everything else, to be really sort of inclusive in that. And I think that's a powerful message, this concept of bridging.
Yeah, totally. And just on the storytelling front, as human beings, that's how we've passed down wisdom and knowledge through generations, right? Pre-internet age, especially, is through stories. And how we've evolved as humans is largely to act based on how we feel, right? So things like the TED Talk from Simon Sinek, how great leaders inspire action and start with why, that why that resonates so powerfully with our emotional drivers, which then determines how and what we do to act. I think stories, and especially stories of hope and leadership and what's possible in this time, are incredibly powerful and important. In terms of the intergenerational bridges, one quite cool practical example there with the Impact Awards. We give out $30,000 to young people doing awesome stuff across 6 categories: climate, inclusion, well-being, enterprise, a local and a global impact award. And one of the models that we made up around the award ceremony is that we'd sell tables for, mostly to big business and big government and organisations and people with purchasing power. And they'd buy a named table, the Deloitte table or whatever, but they'd only get half the seats at the table. Half the seats we'd gift out to young people, our scholarship recipients and our young semi-finalists. And I can't emphasize just how powerful it was to have such a diverse range of, CEOs, senior leaders from big business, big government at the same table with young people from, sometimes marginalized rural communities or some of our most driven young change makers from across the country, just having them at the same table to share a meal, to talk about their aspirations for the future, to start to build on those connections. That was incredibly powerful. And I think there's so many other ways that you can build those bridges, create opportunities where you do bring together young people and older, often kind of senior leaders, influencers, decision makers, to have a conversation around vision for the future, to have a conversation around values, where we want to go, how we might get there, what could you bring, what could I do? And that off the back of those relationships, I think you just get so much more possibility for kind of real collaborative action for impact.
I think that's where the so-called enabling space, just putting different minds, different generations at the same table, but giving them the allowance, sort of taking the agenda away, taking the bias away, taking the politics away, just, let them have that conversation where they can just have a free-flowing conversation. This is the impact. This is for New Zealand, right?
The Impact Awards is, yes, it's just New Zealand focused at the moment. And we built the brand and the campaign off a marketing budget of like $100, and within 2 years, even within the first year, we've attracted the top talent from right across the country, hundreds of applications, every region represented, incredible diversity and caliber of applicants. And then the award ceremony, which year 1, 2019 was in person, and then last year with COVID was online only, but bringing such a diverse range of young movers and shakers and older decision makers together, it's a powerful model.
How is the alumni looking? I mean, you've been doing this for a while. So
Yeah.
as this goes on, I mean, are the alumni giving back? Are they doing quite well? Success stories are there?
Yeah. So it's our 10th birthday this year for Inspiring Stories, right? So within that kind of huge Aotearoa New Zealand focus throughout that time, we've got 10,000 alumni who have taken part in our different programs over the last decade. Collectively, we've put over 2 million into scholarship support for young people, often from quite challenged backgrounds, to experience what can be life-changing opportunities. And then in terms of what alumni are doing or have gone on to do, there's massive diversity in there, right? So we've got young people who maybe previously had never been on an aeroplane in their life, at age 18, go on within a couple of years to win the Prime Minister's Youth Award. Or we've got young people who have gone on to win, major national awards or represent New Zealand on the world stage. We've got young people who have started and are building purpose-driven businesses and social enterprises. We've got young people who, are running for local or central government in a place where no young people have traditionally run for council ever, and are getting in. There's massive diversity within the outcomes of those different alumni. But I think in terms of are they giving back, yes, some are for sure. And some might just be going to university for the first time in their extended family, and so just getting a tertiary education maybe for the first time, and are maybe just coming through that and are not quite in the place where they've got their first full-time job. But I think everyone's got a different means to contribute and give in different ways, whether that's financially or whether it's in other ways, through their time, through their expertise. I think, young people especially don't necessarily have a huge amount of discretionary income, right? At least in New Zealand, if you do go to university, you're probably ticking up a pretty significant student loan to do that. And, the cost of housing is higher than it's ever been. Cost of living is high. So, so it can take a while just to get out of that, what can be enormous debt from ticking up a tertiary education, just to break free of that debt cycle, let alone being in a position to give back. So that's where, again, what I do think young people can bring to the table in spades is that energy, the ideas, the optimism, the ability to kind of mobilise and get things done. They don't necessarily have heaps of financial resources, but if you can pair that with often that older generation who has accumulated wealth, who is in those positions of power, who can mobilise resources in a different way, if you can pair those things together, then that's a really powerful recipe for change.
How has this whole thing impacted you? I mean, on one side, I would imagine you're very tired. On the other side, are you going to run for public office one day, be the prime minister, or? I mean, what is your aspirations out of all this?
Yeah, so look, been doing it for 10 years now, right? And that big bold vision hasn't changed at all. One major thing that has changed is I became a father. So I've got a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old now. So that means outside of work, life is pretty busy, a different kind of busy, but having to put kind of firmer boundaries around things. And, it's meant making sure that we've got a team around us, and we've got an amazing team and an amazing board. We're set up as a charity, but we have to operate like a business and we've come a long way over the past decade, through big ups and downs, just building a model that's much more resilient and financially sustainable. And it feels like the last decade has been kind of prototyping a model for impact, at least in New Zealand, and now the next decade is thinking about scale. And so, last year when COVID happened and we had to transform our Festival for the Future into a virtual summit, to have people from 57 countries around the world engage was pretty mind-blowing, to be honest. Quite a different experience than the in-person event. But we had young people in refugee camps in Rwanda getting up at 4 a.m. to tune in and engage. We had people in Nigeria getting up at 2 a.m. We had, young people across the Pacific. And that kind of, that experience blew me away. I think it just got me thinking a lot more like what we were talking about earlier in the conversation around, what would a global EdTech model for impact look like? So in many ways, because Festival was a virtual summit, we could also undertake our biggest scholarship program ever. Largely as long as people have got access to data and a device, you can give a link and enable access. So I think where we want to take things is very much looking at that kind of EdTech for impact, technology enabled, scalable from day one. It might be a year-round subscription model, but you can also run a huge scholarships program around it to enable access. That's probably one of our next plays, in addition to building on a lot of the really powerful in-person, face-to-face experiences, mentoring, leadership development stuff that we do. Sorry, the other piece for me is obviously thinking about succession, right? So, I'm not going to be around forever, so making sure that we design resilience and succession into our model. Will I run for public office? My wife and I have an ongoing conversation about that. Certainly not right now, but it's not a new conversation and something that I've certainly been asked about before.
Well, I think public office, there's a couple of perspectives on it, and I think it's because of the national context, where sometimes the public office is the only good job out there. So you do have this drive towards, getting into the public service. But I think on the other side, we are slowly, you do see young governments out there, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, you do see young governments out there. But the transition time is going to happen, I think, over the next 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
You see this in America, you see this in, Canada did the transition with Prime Minister Trudeau, so we have a very young Prime Minister in Canada. But we're starting to see in Europe and some of the other places where this transition is going to happen. Mm-hmm. And the leadership mentality, which I think it is really around a mentality. The how to be a good leader is there. It's been written. There's stories, success stories, and the opposite all over the place. What to do, what not to do. The question is now the sort of space to do it and something like that. And I think public service has got a bit of a bad rap. And I think it is the future when you start to look at, specifically now when we have this digital transformation. The internet was one thing. The internet, relatively unsophisticated technology, yet has caused this total disruption over the last 20 years, some positive, some negative, but now the impact around privacy, around rights, around these types of issues. Yeah. And I think Zuckerberg and the Senate committee meetings was a good example where a lot of the government simply don't understand the internet. Yeah. So how are they going to understand artificial intelligence or genomics, biometrics? How are they going to understand a lot of these very sophisticated clusters of technology coming down to us? And how are they going to write good policy for that? And I think there is a transition. So I think there's a transition coming in. I think you'd make a great prime minister.
There's plenty of other great people out there. I think one of the really interesting opportunities with technology and governments is just access to that real-time data to inform investment and decision making. And I think when you start to, you have the data points in place that enables you to overlay, well, here's the kind of potential climate impacts in this particular geographic location, overlaid with here's some of the social inequality that exists in this community or access to education. If we're targeting outcomes and investment in a particular way, where's the opportunity for the multiplier effect through that investment and through those policy decisions? And I think, even with policy development, right, like the opportunity, so many of our policies in New Zealand here, right, are often made, at least traditionally, by a well-intentioned group of people who sit in a physical building, often quite distant from the reality of the people on the ground, who they're really set up there to serve. And so the opportunity to utilize technology and data to actually engage local people on the ground in all sorts of different places and populations who are directly affected by some of those policy decisions to actually inform and shape some of those policy decisions, and in some places co-design them with themselves. Like, I just think there's so many ways that technology can help to improve government processes, decision making, investment decisions, and we're definitely starting to see some changes in that space around New Zealand, and it just has so much potential moving forwards, and feels like it's inevitable, right? And then I think next layer up is, okay, well, what's the global data set? How do we respond to some of these global challenges with all of our kind of private and public sector leaders around the world? That technology has such an important role in how we tackle some of these global challenges as well.
Well, I think this is where, when you look through the whole conversation, it really is moving into the sort of hybrid sort of situation where the public sector is not the public sector of old, the private sector is not the private sector of old, and the civic sector is not. It's all sort of getting into a gray zone where you do have these concepts like sustainable capitalism or sustainable policy, where the concept is really going beyond national borders into these complex areas like climate, for example, or inclusiveness, for example, leave no one behind, everyone gets included. These types of concepts. And it needs a bit of a hybrid sort of education behind that. Ones that can sort of understand business modeling on one side, but also what is the new social contract? What is that? How is that being redesigned and redeveloped and rethought about, reframed in this sort of sense? So it's a fantastic opportunity where it is right now. And I think you've done some marvelous stuff, really have. I mean, I've been watching you, but I certainly go online and see the different things that are happening. Leadership is in demand. I mean, the hunt for strong and viable leadership is really in demand right now.
Yeah. And I think like the intersection between data, technology, and leadership, like you can be a leader or have a leadership team sitting there with all the data in front of you, right? And if you can see through that data that actually this proportion of the population is going hungry every day, or this proportion of the population does not have access to housing, and therefore here's the knock-on effect of that across generations and in the wider community. If you're a leader or somebody in a leadership position and you see those aggregate data sets in front of you, you also need the empathy, you need the mindset, you need the willingness to kind of take risk and deploy capital or resources in a place that can actually alleviate some of those challenges. There's a lot to be thinking about and considering, and you need to be thinking about the potential impacts of that, both in the short term and the long term. So I think there's a lot of demand, like you say, for great leaders, but also a lot of complexity for leaders to navigate in this time as well.
I mean, I'll leave the last statement up to you, but one last thought. I've been doing a lot of research in this area, but I just gave actually a lecture on algorithmic government. So government being actually managed and everything else by an algorithm. And there's a couple of examples of this actually in Japan, where a person was actually, he was in actually the role to run as mayor of one of the cities there, and he was only a proxy for an algorithm. That he was actually proposing that his algorithm would manage everything.
Wow.
And there's been examples in the US as well. This concept of having an algorithm actually govern. And it's a really interesting concept, actually. And there are examples of this going in this direction. We're really relying on a good insight and a balanced analysis of data, this huge amounts of data that are being generated. And now with IoT and everything else will be even more generated as well. So, and it has a big impact on energy consumption, efficiency, supply chain management, these types of things on one side, but also again, getting into what is the well-being of society and how can you measure that, the well-being of society. So it's an interesting concept, but I'll hand over to you to close up with your final statement. What is the wish going forward, or what do you want to say on your final statement as we're running out of time here?
Oh, final statement. Interesting in terms of an algorithm running government. I'm not sure that I'm 100% behind that. I actually had a dream last night that I was being chased by drones. That's another story. When our algorithms might go bad. One final statement. Look, I think more than ever, humanity and us as a population on the planet, we're just more conscious of this one planet, this place that we all call home. And I think really the challenge of our time and the opportunity that we have is how do we come together? Where is that shared humanity to solve these big challenges that we face? And I think there's been all sorts of, yes, of course, conflict and turmoil throughout history, and we're still seeing it at the moment, but equally, there are times when people, when populations, when citizens and governments and businesses can rally together and create real change, and now is that time. And I think COVID gives us a very unique window to think about the world in which we're living, to think about the investments and the actions that we're taking for a fairer, a more inclusive and a more sustainable future. And now is the time for leadership. And that leadership is going to take all of us, not just governments, not just big business. It's you and I, it's all of us working towards that better future. So that's the one statement that I'll share in closing. I believe we can get through this, and I think we have to. I want to be a good answer.
That's great, and you're a great example of that. Okay, Guy Ryan, thanks very much. The Festival of the Future, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks again.
Thanks, David.
Techsauce Global, sparking innovative thoughts. The Near Future Podcast in partnership with Techsauce and SDGX.